Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Tinybones, a mono-black discard deck from Cameron. I myself love Tinybones. What a great guy. Look how small he is. Look how good of a thief he is. Big love. Cameron asks, they want help with general deck balance. They're asking, are there too many discard triggers? Not enough. Enough discard matters triggers? Too many? Does Tinybones need more protection? Should I add a lifelink package? That's a lot of questions. I'll try to answer all of them. And their only budgetary request is keep it below $800 US. Considering the deck is $700 down here, that means about a budget of $90, and I for sure will not be hitting it. I promise you, most of the cards I tend to suggest, I try to keep it below $20, $30. I think that's a nice amount. We shouldn't be upgrading decks past that unless the decks really desperately need that bump in power. But let's get right into it so we can answer some of these questions. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Tinybones Trinket Thief, and why are they the best, the littlest, and just the greatest thief you've ever seen? Tinybones is 2 mana for a 1/2 skeleton rogue. They have 2 abilities, the first one being the main one. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. And then the second ability, for 4 black, each opponent with no cards in their hand loses 10 life. Very, very straightforward card. You know, this is a discard payoff in 2 different ways. You get the payoff for the discard that you're doing by drawing you more cards, and you get the payoff of when your opponents are all empty-handed. For 6 mana, you're doing about 30 damage, is really, really good. So let's look at the deck itself. Almost universally, I like this deck. I think it's in a pretty good place, and I am really going to be pretty picky on some certain points of it. And I'm only doing that because I think the deck itself is really, really strong. Now, I think the big thing right off the bat is that we have 33 lands in the deck. And if we come down to the curve, we can see we do want to cast things up to 7 mana, 6 mana, and some reasonable 5 mana cards. With all that in mind, 33 is just too low. Even with Dark Ritual, even with Bubbling Muck, you know, these things that kind of boost our mana production. We have down here, where are we? Crypt Gas to double our swamps. You know, we've got Urborg, we have Cabal Stronghold, Cabal Coffers. I get the idea that, you know, once we get to a certain amount of lands, we don't want more mana, but I'm going to disagree heavily. I think this is the exact kind of deck that benefits to going to between 35 and 37 lands. You know, I would personally go up to 36, 37 for sure, because you want to be playing all your lands as much as you can, because turn by turn, that mana will really, really matter for the deck. After all, if you draw 50 cards and you can't cast any of them, what's the point? Now, there's a bunch of cards that I think I want to pick at, but before we get to that, I want to very, very quickly note, we have the Burglar Rat package. What do I call it? What do I mean by Burglar Rat package? I mean, we have several copies of a card that is identical to Burglar Rat. These are 2 mana 1/1s that ETB and each opponent discards a card. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I like these cards and I like them better in multiples. Like, the more of this effect we have, the better it is. As if you've played this type of card before, you'll know the first one discards either the worst card in your opponent's hands or a card they wanted to discard anyway. The second one probably gets something a little better, and by the third one, the pressure is very much so on for your opponents. And obviously, these cards work really, really well with other cards that we have, such as Bottomless Pit, such as Painful Quandary, and our Commander. So this kind of strategy, generally, I do like. However, and we're going to touch back to this later, they are kind of weaker cards. That's kind of the downside of it. So we have like Virus Beetle, Nezumi Informant, Elderfang, Disciple, and Burglar Rat. These cards, 4 of them I think are a good number. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4. But we have to remember when we draw these in the late game, they're dead draws. And though that's not particularly bad because of the card draw we will have and the ones I want to add to the deck, it's still a real thing to be in the late game drawing a card that just doesn't have the same power as any other card in your deck. So we're going to keep that in mind, and I'm going to have 2 suggestions near the end to go into, like, to kind of think about if we want to keep them in, which personally I do really like how they are. But let's pick at a few other cards, because we do actually have to cut some cards for lands before we even get into additions, so let's make our way through them. First things first, I want to cut our top 2 planeswalkers in mana cost, Liliana Vess and Professor Onyx. Now we have a Liliana theme, and I feel, I was saying this recently, sometimes we just have a collection of planeswalkers for either sentimental or flavor purposes, and I think very much so that's what's happening here. Of the Lilianas, I really do like the combination of Lily of the Veil and Lily Waker of the Dead. Both of these creatures, these planeswalkers are very, very good. They're better together, and they work great in this kind of strategy. However, Lily Vess and Professor Onyx do not. Professor Onyx, notably, is one of the few Lilianas that I think doesn't work with discard at all. We generally have, you know, discard lilies and zombie lilies, and this is a weird third Magecraft lily, and I just don't think this is where we want to be, especially 6 mana with a deck with kind of low land count right now. And even if we do buff the land count, I don't really see Professor Onyx being kind of the hit the deck really wants in comparison to some of its other finishers, such as Turgid or Painful Quandary. Liliana Vess is just slow. She's just so slow. She has a +1 you never want to use because it's just fundamentally worse than all of the other Lily's +1s. And then she has a -2, which you're probably going to take 2 turns to use. Each time, this doesn't even get you a card, it puts it on top of your deck, and you're really going to feel the slowness of the card, especially after you pay 5 mana for her. So with that in mind, I really want to cut both of them. After them, and this may be a bit controversial, but Containment Construct doesn't really fit for me in this deck. This benefits decks that it says whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you may play that card this turn. However, I just don't see us discarding that many cards. Don't get me wrong, we do have a collection of cards such as, you know, both Lilies, we have Necrogen Mists, we have Bottomless Pit, we have Oppression. All of these cards will make us discard our own cards, Dark Deal as well. So, like, to an extent, I get why it's there. However, this is kind of, in a deck that doesn't loot or rummage, I feel like this is just kind of planning for failure, right? When this deck is functional, it is going to be doing really well of just rummaging through the entire, not even rummaging, just kind of drawing through the entirety of your deck, that whenever you discard something, you're generally going to be happy never seeing it again. And how often are you going to be able to, you know, resolve Dark Deal, discard your hand, and still have a ton of mana to cast those spells with? I'm sure it'll happen now and then, but not to the point that I want to play a 2-1 for 2 for it, right? And this is almost ironically a card that your opponents might want to play more than you do, and that's probably a sign that it doesn't belong on your side of the battlefield. Likewise, down here I see, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but over here is Crucible of Worlds with its new art. And I think Crucible of Worlds is a really interesting card, but I don't think this is the deck for it. We don't play fetch lands, so we can't naturally put our lands in outside of discard. We don't mill. We don't tutor lands into our graveyard. It feels like the best way to use this is that we're going to plus on one of our lilies and discard a land from our hand, and then you get to go, oh cool, I get to now play that back on the battlefield, to which I think, did you pay 3 mana for that? Really? Like, 3 mana, especially early game, even mid game, is a lot of mana to do something that I think you really don't need. If you're desperate, like, the only one that's really a combo here is Emergence Zone and Blast Zone, the only 2 I should say. And Command Beacon, I guess, but like, are those really the cards we want to get back? Even Takenuma, though technically we channel it into our graveyard, it's not, well, we want it back in our hand, not into our graveyard, so it doesn't really count. So it is neat that we can use this card to bring these, you know, these effects back, but it feels like a really shallow card in a deck like this. Like, you're just not going to get a lot of hits. And once again, this is a card that I think your opponents would be really happy playing against you, which is just the sign that you shouldn't be playing it yourself. Whether this deck is, you know, going off or just in neutral, I think you know, we don't really want to be using Crucible of Worlds. So that's another easy cut for me. Looking at the creatures, I think Marlin of the Morn Song is definitely one that I would like to cut. Now, I think Marlin of the Morn Song is a really, really cool card. Players can't draw cards, and at each end step, they lose life and they tutor for a card. But the thing is you don't get to use Marlin first. You get to actually use Marlin last. And traditionally, if you play this against me and I'm next in turn order, I will get a card that both kills Marlin and gives me some kind of card advantage or some board advantage or something like that, right? So not only all you kind of did was bolt your opponent, right? Now I do get how this first bit of text here, players can't draw cards, that's really powerful against certain strategies to stop them from, you know, drawing out of your means to discard. But I really think in those situations, you're just gonna prefer oppression or painful quandary to get them back down to hand size. Because as they cast spells, you know, even if they're casting Blue Sun Zenith for 5, drawing 5 cards, yeah, that's rough. But you're gonna lose those cards very, very quickly, bringing you back. And I think just having those cards and a proactive plan is just much, much better than playing a particularly, you know, cumbersome card that only happens to have the upside of players can't draw cards, right? I think there's a lot of situations that you are opening yourself up to, you know, an opponent getting either like a Nev's Disc or All Is Dust or Farewell or something that not only will take care of Marlin, but also get rid of all of your enchantments, which are honestly some of the strongest parts of the deck, right? The thing with this card is you need constant pressure, and a lot of our constant pressure comes from our enchantments. So I feel like this is just like it's like creating a weakness that the deck itself did not have to solve a problem the deck does not need solved. That's how I feel about it. Also, she's $30, my goodness. I wish she was better. That art is so, so cool. Going a bit further, another two that come to mind. Rankle, I just want to take a moment to talk about Rankle. I don't think I like Rankle. I don't know. Rankle is a card that I'm always unimpressed with. I always feel like Rankle comes out and has a big show of like, you know, the player who plays Rankle gets to use all of these abilities, but oftentimes it's never quite that good. I'm not really gonna just straight advocate for you to take them out, but I wanted to say that. I wanted to voice my kind of disappointment in the card. I just don't think it's that good. If you're outside of Fairy or Rogue, Kindred, if you're outside of using them as a commander, if you don't have very specific combos, which the discard synergy is there, but that second line is so tempting. Each player loses 1 life and draws a card. Especially, like, I would use pretty much every mode. Like, when you use Rankle, you want to use all 3 modes every time, if you ask me. And with that in mind, I just don't think that really belongs here. And secondary, I think in Commander these days, Rankle's ability to get in repeatedly is really, really low. People are running Lightning Bolt more than ever. People have a lot of flyer blockers more than ever. You know, there's just too much, I think, that interferes with Rankle, to the point that, like, maybe I would want to play Rankle's Prank to get that instant satisfaction of casting it. And I believe Rankle's Prank is, let's take a look at it, is better because it's double. Rankle's Prank. Each player discards 2, loses 4, sacrifices 2. Yes, Rankle's Prank is a stronger version of Rankle, if you ask me. Perhaps only in multiplayer, but I definitely think I would rather the Prank than Rankle himself. Oops, going the wrong direction. But the real one I want to talk about was Sangromancer. Sangromancer, I think, is just a little too cute. Let's answer one of those questions Cameron asked. Cameron asked, should I add a life gain package? Now, I don't think so. You're not losing life at a very, very quick rate. You're not playing Bolas' Citadel, and if you were, which is a card I was considering suggesting, but I didn't end up doing it, that would be a reason to think more about life gain. But I think you do have a life gain package, and their name is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Now you might say, well, that's not, I mean, that's kind of a finisher. It's not life gain. It is definitely life gain. It's life gain that all black, and especially mono black decks have access to, and it's probably one of the best, you know? And with that in mind, I think Gray Merchant should be your life gain. And Sangromancer, though very, very cute, like don't get me wrong, in the right situations, she'll draw you so many cards. I think a lot of times it's just going to kind of hang around and eat removal. This deck is already generally kind of immune to a lot of board clear effects or a lot of specific kind of pressure, and Sangromancer is one of those cards that just needs to stick around while you do what you want to do at 4 mana. I don't like that. Like our commander works this way, and our commander is 2 mana. Sangromancer is too much mana, not good enough. If it like drained, if this was instead of gain 3 life on both, like your opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, even if it was like a third of it, I still would like it a lot more. I would rather the pressure on our opponents than the straight life gain, even if it represents an obscene amount of life gain. The other card that you have life gain is right here, Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Cast Sheoldred, then use Dark Ritual into Dark Deal, and you are very far ahead and your opponents are very far behind. I think those 2 cards, Gray Merchant and Sheoldred, represent enough card life gain that you shouldn't really need anything else. Going to the ends, the last one I don't know how I feel about is Necrogoyf. Actually I have one more in the creatures, but Necrogoyf, I find, once again, Necrogoyf is a little like Containment, Containment Construct, where this is a card I think belongs in a Madness deck, more like a proper Madness deck than just a self-discard incidentally deck, you know? Without red or blue around to loot or rummage, Necrogoyf is a lot harder to Madness, and then even when we Madness it, we still have to cast that like 3 black. Like, once again, don't get me wrong. If you use either of our smaller lilies, if you discard it to Bottomless Pit, you know, if you cast something low mana and you discard it to Oppression, well, that last one's not very good because then you cast the Necrogoyf and you get another Oppression trigger, so I don't know if that's really worth it, but, you know, I get the idea of all of these things coming together, and you get a Necrogoyf, and immediately on the next upkeep, your opponents start discarding 1 at a time per upkeep. I get it, but even then, this isn't a creature I particularly think it's easy to cheat out, and even then, I don't think I want it. Compared to all of your other cards, this creature is notably weak. It is, you know, strong, but at the same time, easy to block. It's just clunky, is how I feel, so I would cut it. And then the last card, and this is definitely a controversial take, is Turgid. Turgid, God of Fright, is a card that I think it's good enough, but I think it should be seen as a finisher. I don't think it's a card you play out fairly, and I have some suggestions for it once we get like to support it a little more. But this is a card that when she's not the commander, she's harder to go off. Like, you really have to plan and you have to have a big turn. Much like Sheoldred, you have to Dark Ritual into Dark Deal immediately, I would say. Otherwise, she's eating a Swords to Plowshares, and frankly, I think she is either way eating a Swords to Plowshares. But still, I think she is very, very strong, but I just wanted to note there's a bit of a ceiling on her power in a deck like this. Looking through the rest, a few cards I'll pick out real fast before we go into additions. Massacre feels just a little too weak for a deck like this. I get that it's free, but -2/-2 is selectively good against, token decks, and even then, you have Toxic Deluge and Damnation and Mutilate. I feel like those are more than enough that Massacre just feels kind of overkill. Cut down, should that be Fatal Push? I would say so, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. Cut down, I feel like, misses a lot of relevant commanders, notably because it misses 3/3s. And I think 3/3s is a very common commander stat line, and so I would rather Fatal Push because at least you can set up ways that you can destroy four mana commanders. Don't get me wrong, this will hit some higher, more powerful commanders every now and then, but it's very, very niche to be able to regularly hit things with that. Funeral Charm, feels also very niche. I'm just generally impressed with this card. In Commander, we really don't want to do 1-for-1s, especially when we're the control deck, which we are the control deck. And this card lives and dies by the fact that you can discard your opponent's only card that they just drew on their draw step. That's what makes this card neat, and that's not good enough in Commander. That's a 1-for-1 deal with 3 opponents that are using it to kill a X1, and even that, I don't think so. There is something cute that target creature gains Swamp Walk when you have Urborg out and you can get an attack in, but as far as I can tell, you do not have creatures that desperately need to hit to do something, and therefore I don't think it's very much so worth it. It can be cute in order to give your opponents, unblockable as a kind of treat, but then you need to also play Tainted Strike, because that is absolutely the king of, haha, I helped my opponent defeat one of my other opponents. Very quickly, looking at our artifacts, I think they're generally fine. Looking at our enchantments, also I think they're generally fine. Okay, let's just go into additions. I was hoping this is going to be a shorter episode, and I think we can make it. Tainted Strike, play Tainted Strike, even if I'm the one who just threw it out there. All right, Nirkana Revenant. Nirkana Revenant is one of 2 cards I wanted to suggest for mana. If I wanted to suggest a top end of this deck that plays with the card draw and your commander, it would be Nirkana Revenant, and it would be Magus of the Coffers. It could also be that last night I played against a mono block Lily deck that's very similar to your deck, and these 2 cards were both on the battlefield at the same time as Urborg and Cabal Coffers. Whew, boy, that was a lot of mana generated. And specifically for Tinybones, which I think would have been better in that situation, your ability to not only set up several discards to get your opponent's Hellbent, but then take a turn to generate, I don't know, 12, 18 mana, and then just dump it into Tinybones to get that trigger as many times as you can and probably knock out some of your opponents. I think that's pretty good. And that's not even including how good these are just as general good cards in your deck. Following up with mana generation is card generation. This is a deck that is pretty powerful, I would say, and so I don't feel bad suggesting a few more powerful draw effects. So Dark Confidant, and this is probably just a shout out, this is the moment if you've been watching the video, pay attention to this and nothing else. Dark Confidant is $5, maybe $7, depends, it's US dollars, so here would be a little more expensive, but Dark Confidant is about $5 to $10. If you don't have Dark Confidants for your black decks, please pick them up. They are phenomenal. They are such a good card. If you're playing at a power level that like Bowmasters is played around in, Dark Confidant gets worse, but most of us do not play at that power level. This is a phenomenal card, and at this price, this used to be a $50, $60, $70 card. Please pick this up. This is a great card for card advantage. It'll work really well in your deck. It'll be better than some of the other like containment construct, just better in that slot, get you a little further in your deck, get you ahead of things like Necrogen Mists or Bottomless Pit. Notably both of those because you stack them. If you're Hellbent, you discard first, then you draw off Dark Confidant. You'll be getting very far ahead very quickly. Another one, this is definitely a weaker card, but always really nice to see, is Sign in Blood. Especially when you're mono black, you do not need to play Knight's Whisper, though you still can in certain builds. I do like Sign in Blood. Have I ever targeted my opponent with Sign in Blood in Commander? I don't think so, but this would be the deck to do it, so you could get more Waste Not triggers and the like. There's a few neat things you'd be able to do with it. This would be the only place I would target Sign in Blood to my opponents, unless I desperately wanted Orcish Bowmaster triggers. So, regardless, easy inclusion. And then finally, of course, also cheaper than it's ever been is Necropotence, hanging around $10, depending on the version. I really do like this art personally, but once again, your deck is at the power level that I am very confident with giving you, suggesting Necropotence. It might make you think about life gain and how to use it with cards like Shieldred a little more, especially because it doesn't work with Shieldred the way you think it does. However, this is just an immensely powerful card. If you can Dark Ritual this out at any point in the game, you will be very happy. Then I wanted to talk about a few options concerning the Burglar Rats. So, this is about burglar rats and other cards. I wanted to suggest some reanimate. We're kind of low on creatures, but I think the majority of our creatures are strong enough that we want to be able to get them back. We want some recursion. So I've got a few cards here and there that hit some of them, and at the end I have my final suggestion on recursion. But Unearth is the easiest one. It is a card I like playing in low to the ground decks. You have a good amount of 3 mana or less creatures. You can cycle this away. It's very, very safe. It's very, very strong. I think this is the easiest inclusion. If you cut out some of the burglar rats, this card does get worse, so keep that in mind. Victimize would be the other one I'd suggest. Now this is definitely more mana, but I really do like that this will pull any of the creatures out of your deck, but it also will sacrifice a creature. We're going to come back to this in a second, but I think this is something your deck is somewhat missing with a few of its strategies. So the last version of Reanimate, well, second last, let's say, is the Not Dead After All. These are the Undying Evil effects. So all these Undying effects all trigger on the creature dying, and they immediately come back. This is very, very good on a number of your creatures, and it functions as protection as well. So you can proactively use it on like Grey Merchant, or you can reactively use it on Tinybones, Turgid, things like that, Shieldred. I find these to be good to be played 1 or 2 of. I tend to like them more with sack outlets, but generally, if you're in mono black especially, you're kind of hard on protection. It's just there's not a lot, right? And these Not Dead After All Undying Evil effects can be the protection you want. It is the 1 mana, get your creature back after a board clear, after a bolt, after Blasphemous Act. It does not stop things like Swords to Plowshares, it does not stop Farewell, but cards gotta die one way or another. You can't have it all, right? Going back to, let's go back to Braids in a second. Let's talk about Sacrifice. So Ashnod's Altar is here, and was that the only one? That was the only one I've added because I just wanted this to be under this kind of umbrella. So I wouldn't mind if you had some more Sacrifice. Now it's up to you what you want it to look like, but one of the things is you have 2 pieces that make me want you to have Sacrifice effects. One, you have Burglar Rats and the like, which are just 1/1s once they stay on the battlefield. And so you either want to sacrifice them so you can get more value out of them, such as Ashnod's Altar, to make you mana, or you want to sacrifice them so you can put them into the graveyard. That's a lot more notable with Grey Merchant. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is a fantastic finisher, provided you can blink it a bunch of times. And maybe, as we all know, blinking in black is hard. However, the blinking out of the graveyard is the best way to do this. So you can have these Undying Evil effects, you can have Victimize, you can have any form of reanimation, but in order for it to go off, you need a way to put it back into the graveyard yourself. I think it is incredibly wishful thinking, let's say, to assume that it'll naturally go into the graveyard. Now, you can use a board wipe, you can point removal at it, but you never know when your opponents have a Swords to Plowshares, especially when they suspect you're going to reanimate that card. So having something like Ashnod's Altar, having maybe Viscera Seer, maybe what's our zombie? Carrion Feeder. Almost had it. Having these cards around to eat your smaller creatures or your bigger creatures and ensure they go back to the graveyard. So when someone tries to Swords to Plowshare one of these cards, you can get them back for later. Going back to Braids for a second, I do think Braids really does belong in this deck. This is a very, very strong effect, especially with the Burglar Rats. Once again, I do want you to keep the Burglar Rats, and so this would be a really good payoff. There was a question, let's go back to Cameron's questions. The main idea was, am I too far into discard? Am I too far into discard payoffs? Like, how do I kind of even it out? Do we need more protection? I'm hoping I covered the protection right now before with the reanimations. But one of the ways we fix these things, like having too many discard triggers or too many discard payoffs, is by having our payoffs and enablers kind of be parallel, or let's say complementary, right? So Braids, though Braids doesn't work in the traditional idea of how discard works, right? Because our opponents aren't discarding cards when Braids gets triggers. Instead, this is generally pressuring the permanents they already have on the field. But Braids gives you something to do with all those Burglar Rats that stick around. It gives you something to do late game to those enchantments that aren't really doing, like there's a certain point that Necrogen Mists isn't doing anything anymore, and braids represents a way to turn that into card advantage and damage. Also, the kind of relationship that specifically discard and sacrifice have is they're both getting better in multiples, and they both pressure different parts of the game at different points. So if your opponents have kind of tried to outsmart you by playing all their good cards so you can't toss them out of their hands, braids is really great at pressuring the cards that are already on the battlefield, especially if they kind of overreached, you know, and like they haven't played well, so their board is susceptible to being picked apart, right? Finally, even if they don't sacrifice, the sheer card advantage that braids generates is actually insane. Also the life loss. Maybe my next deck should be a braids deck. Maybe I should make mono black braids. We'll get back to that. My final addition I'd like to put in is Phyrexian Reclamation. So, this is the final kind of protection reanimation thing. This is like I'm putting this at the end because in a deck that's like 18 creatures, and I've suggested to take a few of them out maybe, Phyrexian Reclamation feels a little strange. But I will say, on turns where you have enormous amounts of mana, a sack outlet, and like the ability to reanimate your creatures, Phyrexian Reclamation, oh, you don't even need to reanimate your creatures, sorry, that's what the Reclamation does. So with a sack outlet, creatures, and Phyrexian Reclamation, you can do absurd things. It isn't free, it costs 2 additional each time to cast the cards, and it costs 2 life every time you do so. But we're talking about when you have like Cabal Coffers mana, and you are generating, what, like 15 to 20 mana. Being able to cycle a Burglar Rat, especially if you have Ashnod's Altar, so it's paying a bit of the mana cost to play it again, over and over again, putting your opponents down back to Hellbent, and then spending the rest of the mana into Tinybones to just completely defeat them, is fantastic. So Phyrexian Reclamation is just a card I'm always impressed by, and I wanted to suggest it here as it's just honestly phenomenal. Just a very, very strong card. And that's it. Those are my additions. I hope I answered all of your questions. I know I didn't sit down and just go through them all one after the other, but I think I touched on all of them as much as I could. Once again, honestly, the first thing I would really recommend is going up in lands, but I think this deck is really, really cool, and I'm really excited to see what you do with it. I hope this video was helpful to you, and if you do make another draft, I'd love to see it. Good luck, and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.